No nuclear reactors since. And there is a problem with nuclear power besides the threat of a meltdown. There is a finite amount of uranium. And so that's always one of the problems when people say, well, we should try more nuclear. There's a couple big problems with it. But Carter actually went into this while it was near a meltdown. He was a Naval Academy graduate. And so did we get to this? Okay, so the Iranian Revolution, 1979. So this goes back to the Shah was overthrown. Oh, wait. Why do I have Shah's on? Why do I have two arrows there? The Shah was overthrown in 1979. This had been growing for a very long time. But don't forget, the Shah was put into power, and that's why the revolutionaries blamed the United States. Because back, remember, 1953, the U.S. overthrew a very vibrant democracy in Iran. Now, vibrant, yes, it had flaws as every other government, but it was a homegrown democracy, and they overthrew it. Therefore, they blamed the United States for their problems. And yes, the United States did deserve some blame. But then again, as the conflict through the government, the Shah was overthrown. Here he is fleeing went to Panama. Here's right before it happened. Carter didn't personally like the Shah, but he felt he had to stick with him because of the Cold War, didn't want to look soft on communism. But then the Shah got sick. And that is going to lead, jump the gun here. The Ayatollah Khomeini, so one step above Mullah, one of the major leaders of the Iranian Shia faith. He had actually been in exile in France. He arrived back and would create an Islamic State. Now, it's unclear whether or not that Islamic State would have held if not for the perceived threat of the United States putting the Shah back in power. The United States had no plans to do this. They realized it would have been impossible, but they didn't believe that in Iran. And that allowed the Ayatollah to create a totalitarian Islamic State, which in some ways still exists to this day. Yes, with the United States as their enemy. And they always go back to 53. But then the Shah got cancer, and that's going to lead to the Iranian hostage crisis. The Shah got cancer. The United States allowed him into the United States for treatment. He died really quickly afterwards. But to Iran, it's 53 all over again. They thought this was all just a massive cover. And therefore, encouraged by the government, students, but these are just have been radicalized by revolution. They stormed the United States Embassy, which had a skeleton staff. Over 60 were taken hostage. They would release some, but for 444 days, 51 Americans were held hostage inside the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. And this made the United States feel weak. They couldn't do anything to get them out. Carter seemed inept, even though it's not clear what he could have done without killing them. There would be a hostage rescue attempt that was a disastrous failure. And so the point was, it gave this general perception after Vietnam, and then with the bad economy and the inflation, high oil prices, stagflation, that the United States was growing weak. And even though the country was behind Carter at first, his popularity began to drop dramatically. Of course, that also went with oil prices going up. And then, at the same time, the Soviets invade Afghanistan. Now, the Soviet Union had a puppet government in Afghanistan, and they were modernizing, yes, once again in quotes, but then that government was replaced. And the Soviets thought that could be the spreading Islamic revolution. This area of the Soviet Union, now Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, etc., are all Muslim majorities. They were worried it would spread from Iran here. Now, that made no sense. Mostly Shia Muslim, mostly Sunni. The Russians didn't realize it. They invaded to put in a pro-Soviet government. And to many who felt after Vietnam, détente was a mistake, Boom, the Cold War is on again, overnight. And this really fueled a conservative revival, like we're going to win the Cold War. So all of you young men are going to register for the draft next year. That Selective Service Act that would be passed in 1979 came right after this. And also the United States went from overnight. We have better relations, they're the same time, recognize China too, the Cold War is on. And more dangerous than ever before, the United States is falling behind. In fact, this is going to be start about 78, 79 as part of Soviet attempt to invade. So here's Soviet soldiers coming in. It turned to a disastrous 9-year war for Russia. Soviet Union, sorry. I should add that in 1980, the Olympics was going to be in Moscow. The U.S. boycott. 1984, it was the Los Angeles Olympics. The Soviets boycott. And so the Olympics, which, yes, I know it's basically for money, but this idea of amateur athletics to go beyond political conflicts, of course there's going to be political conflicts involved in that. And then the hostages would be held all the way until literally the day Carter's successor, Ronald Reagan, was inaugurated. In fact, the Iranians waited. They waited and did not let them off so they could time it for them getting off the plane just after Reagan was inaugurated. That's a slap in the face to Carter. Even though Carter did finally negotiate their release. 444 days. And this is going to lead to a series of events like that. There are going to be a number of Americans going to be held in Lebanon and other places, and terrorism seemed to be on the rise. Well, the election of 1980 then had this hostage crisis, Cold War, high prices, the Federal Reserve raising interest rates. The Democrats were actually kind of in disarray. The old New Deal guard was being replaced by these reformers who were going to neoliberalism. Carter won actually a tough primary bid, but a lot of Democrats were very disappointed in Carter. Carter's negatives were about as low as you could get by that time. And it came in very popular. The Republicans would nominate somebody who wanted the nomination back in 1976 and almost got it before, Ronald Reagan. Reagan had been the governor of California. He had been an actor, but he really became famous when he did a bunch of tours around the country promoting American capitalism and anti-communism in the 1950s for General Electric. And he was part of that new conservative revival that began with Barry Goldwater. But unlike Goldwater, Reagan was a magnificent speaker, always talking about optimism and where America could be and what America was, and we could go back to that again, and really symbolized that conservative revival that kind of came with this part of this backlash that was going on in the 60s and 70s. Let's go back to when America was great. And yes, that was Reagan's slogan. Let's make America great again. Let's make America great again. And of course, Donald Trump blatantly copied that in 2015. And because it was a very effective slogan. And that fits in with, remember, 1920 Warren G. Harding had returned to normalcy. So to get back to this perceived better time. But the big thing was, it was the economic issues. High inflation was stagflation. The Federal Reserve was raising interest rates. And also, and underlying everything was oil prices. We have a country our entire economy is based upon the internal combustion engine, especially at that time. So oil prices going up affected everything. Then you have, of course, this feeling that the United States was losing the Cold War, and we're now weak. And Carter, it's one of those weird things. Carter seemed weak, which is interesting. This Naval Academy graduate who was on a nuclear-powered submarine, and kind of like McGovern was perceived as weak. He wasn't personally, but perceived as it. And then the growing religious right, who really, they taught family values. And going back to that traditional role, the traditional role of women, remember the anti-ERA fight. And even though it started with issues over schools, about private religious schools that the IRS was looking to whether or not they had proper religious tax status. And by the way, what? Yeah, that was a huge deal in 1978. That would begin to coalesce fundamentalist Christians towards the Republican Party. And then, but that seemed a little bit shaky. It was tied to segregation. Abortion became the key issue. Fundamentalist Christians actually were either were apolitical or that did not formulate any part of their voting up to 76. After about 1978, fundamentalist Christians overwhelmingly begin to vote Republican. And now it's about 90%. And it starts right here. And abortion was one of the key issues. And the Republican Party in 1976, their platform was for abortion rights. 1980 and ever since, anti-abortion. And they've waged a 42-year battle to get rid of abortion rights, and it looks like they're going to succeed. So next, in parentheses, because this is the quiet part, also ending the New Deal. Reagan had talked against Social Security. Reagan had talked against Medicare and Medicaid, which is, I know, Great Society, but like they saw the conclusion of the New Deal, Reagan was intensely anti-union. But these programs are relatively popular, so they talked more about wasteful government spending and not the actual programs themselves. So it was kind of shocking how fast it happened. Reagan was actually behind in the polls up until fall. And then it reversed and then just snowballed to Carter looking like he might win Carter might win, to Reagan might win a close election, to a Reagan landslide. But a lot of it was just an anti-Carter vote, or a better way to look at it is just this feeling was overtaking the country of malaise, like we're going the wrong direction. Nobody knew what the right direction was necessarily, or disagreed on that. They just felt wrong. And this is going to be a big shift. You can see it coming, but wow, what a change. Well, Reagan actually came in not that popular. It was an anti-Carter vote. And his program was stalled in Congress. People were fearful of the U.S. getting involved in the war in Nicaragua. And then the next thing, two hawks flying together just flew at my side. So I look at the hawks, but now they're gone. So, and then, just 2.5 months after his inauguration, there was an assassination attempt. John Hinckley, who was convinced that if he killed President Reagan, the actress Jodie Foster would fall in love with him. He had suspicions. But he unloaded a revolver at Reagan just seconds before this picture was taken. The police officer was horribly injured along with his press secretary. Reagan was hit right here. And they put him into the car, and the limousine rushed him to the hospital. And this is something I vividly remember. I mean, I vividly remember this assassination. Okay. Because I was sitting in study hall, 8th grade, sitting at little tables in the auditorium, or they had a kind of auditorium open area in the middle school. I was at Washington Middle School. And our study hall teacher, Mrs. Fretland, weird, I remember that so vividly. But somebody called her over, and she went over. Her said, I don't know why, I just happened to be looking there. She came back white as a sheet. And she said, President has been shot. and start to cry and run out. And we just all assumed that the president was dead. I mean, wouldn't that be, and we never forget that. And it was hours before we found out that he was just in the hospital. Remember, back then, you had to wait. I guess the news, they took the hospital, was be a couple of hours later, they announced that the surgery was successful. As it turned out, it was very close. He nearly died. But he recovered fast. Reagan had a few nice little witticisms. Like right where he went under. He said, "Well, make sure the doctors are Republican." Clever. And also wave from the window to the just the day after his surgery, and this kind of pluckiness, which it was hiding how bad it really was, turned public opinion. And Democrats still control the House of Representatives, but they began to support his programs because they're also becoming more conservative. But also, it just turned public opinion informed. It also probably triggered the beginnings of dementia and Alzheimer's. By the end of his presidency, they were hiding it from the public, but he was clearly having suffering from Alzheimer's. That's what would kill him, which is a horrible thing. Yes, they hid it from the public, but that allowed his economic proposal, which it didn't look like was going to pass, and it would soon be dubbed Reaganomics, but it was supply side. Remember, supply side is a nice way of saying trickle down economics. So the plan was to pump money in the hands of the very wealthy. This would increase supply because they'll start investing in factories and increase supply. And that will get prices down, the economy booming again. That was the plan. And so the big elements of it, massive deregulation. No more antitrust control. In fact, they totally went against the normal idea that monopolies were a concentration of power to monopolies were more efficient, and that's a good thing. And we have been at that. It's changing now, but I don't know how long that's going to change. To now, it's so much different now than what it was even in 1980. It's just shocking. We have about half as many general retail stores now than we did in 1980. It's just kind of amazing to me because everything's a monopoly or a chain store monopoly or whatever it might be. And they also massive cutting of social programs. And the social programs, the idea was the tiny little bits they would give for, they called it welfare, a little bit of money for welfare, aid for school lunch, aid for colleges. The thought was the poor were getting dependent upon. They quit working. They were losing their faith to work. We have to take that away. So they go get a job on their own and show that they can make it on their own. By the way, what is that philosophy called? Yeah, it's very social Darwinistic. So I got to come back to that. That's social Darwinism. The one I vividly remember, and it's a little bit unfair, but it's still kind of startling, is they want to cut school lunch programs in half. School lunch program was a program that basically would be expanded during the Great Society and Lyndon Johnson. And one of the most expensive things at school lunches, the subsidy for that would be fresh vegetables. And so they said, well, we already provide fresh vegetables. We'll always provide ketchup. Ketchup is a fresh vegetable. And it's red. And if you look at the ingredients of ketchup, about the fifth one down is tomato. What's the number one ingredient in ketchup, by the way? Good guess. Vinegar, then salt, then water, then more salt. But the big thing were tax cuts. Tax cuts. And they were aggressive, meaning the tax cuts went to the very wealthy. So the highest marginal income tax rate went from 70 to 50 to 28. Eventually down to 28% by the end of the administration. I should add, for most people, taxes would go up because they doubled the Social Security. So for most people, taxes went up. There were actually 12 tax increases passed during the Reagan administration, but most of those would be taxes that would hit working people hard. And the whole idea was they would take this money and invest, and then eventually that would bring wages up. Also, it would increase so much economic activity that the deficits would drop. The deficits will drop because economic activity will go up. Even if they cut taxes, they'll actually, taxes will go up, they said. As it turned out, that did not happen. Taxes arguably kind of went up because they doubled Social Security, but not because of this. And eventually would lead to the largest deficits in history up to that time. Then we got to the COVID deficit of the last Trump year or the first Biden year. In fact, the accumulated debt of the Reagan years was greater than the accumulated debt of the United States from 1776 to 1980. Now, the debt is that's not necessarily a bad thing, but they ran on fiscal discipline. So a couple more things about Reaganomics. While this was going on, a massive increase in defense spending. Reagan said there's a window of vulnerability. The United States is now vulnerable to nuclear attack. And there's all these threats of these new Soviet weapons. So they increased defense spending by 10% the first 2 years, each year. The reason why Reagan wanted 10% is because Carter said 5%. And they started talking about nuclear war and winning a nuclear war. And Reagan sincerely believed that we could win a nuclear war. And the United States started doing all these provocative things to the Soviet Union, like flying entire fighter squadrons of over 20 planes at the Soviet border, they did this a lot in the Black Sea, but also on the East German border where the Iron Curtain was. Right at the frontier, turned the last second, just to test the reaction. Or like send submarines into Soviet waters or try to sneak into Vladivostok Harbor, things like that. Very provocative. And a massive arms buildup. And part of the reason the US had this big buildup is because the CIA. The CIA said the Soviets were doing a massive buildup. This is from Time magazine. And this was CIA data showing a massive Soviet defense buildup. And so the United States started spending because of this. As it turned out, the exact opposite was happening. The Soviet Union was actually cutting defense spending because her economy was in free fall. But the CIA all this time justified this spending. And that's where you get the CIA. There was a big joke that the CIA doesn't really know what's going on. They want to hear the defense spending, so they see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil. Has anyone seen the movie Planet of the Apes? The original? How about the newer ones? Huh?
You're watching it.
From 1971? All right. If you want to see some good, solid overacting. So if intelligence says something, remember, it's kind of a best guess, and they're very ideological too. So once again, be skeptical of most things. So the US began a massive arms buildup. But one of the most provocative would be called Star Wars. It would be dubbed Star Wars. But it was a missile defense system called the Strategic Defense Initiative. And it was going to put a shield over the United States to defend from Soviet missiles. And it wasn't just going to be anti-missile missiles, which are incredibly hard and difficult to do, and easy to do by any relatively modern country. But also they were going to have particle beams, laser beams. They were going to put a negative matter net over the United States to catch missiles they talked about. Okay, none of this technology was realistic, but it totally terrified the Soviets. To the Soviets, they looked at this potential like the United States is planning a first strike. And the Soviets knew our economy is in free fall. Why is America going through this massive defense buildup? The United States has clear advantages. Why are they doing this? Because they're going to attack. And that is going to lead to the Able Archer War Scale. Able Archer War Scale. And it was all year. So the Soviets had just gone through two new leaders. They kept getting older and older, more fossilized leaders. And Ronald Reagan would dub the Soviet Union the evil empire. Yes, Star Wars came, it was 83. The third of the Star Wars movies just came out, the Return of the Jedi. Yes, I know that. Yes, I watched that at the theater. No, it's not very good. It is significantly better than anyone that came after it. So it's not very good. Who had seen it? Well, the Evil Empire, they're all playing on this. Like Reagan loved it. He watched it in the basement. They have a theater in the basement. And then the Soviets just were convinced this is going to be all a preemptive strike. They had this whole list of things laid out what the United States was going to do. Build up weapons. They were going to do a change of currency because after the war, they're going to have all kinds of problems with currency. The European Common Market, which is now the European Union, had just announced plans to make the euro. The Soviets did. And then the NATO was going to do a massive war games called Naval Archer, where they were going to have all the leaders of NATO countries go to safe areas, all these kind of things. And to Soviet intelligence, that's going to mask the attack. And in September 1983, the Soviets were within 1 hour of attack, preemptive strike. Cooler heads prevailed when they were finally convinced by enough of their intelligence, and British intelligence let them know it's just a drill. And British intelligence somehow figured it out. It wound its way through West German intelligence, got to the United States, and it was literally like, we almost had World War III. The US had no idea, just shocked them. We almost had World War III. Back when Reagan found out, he was kind of stunned. I should have every Saturday the president would give a radio address, and it was just one of those little big for radio stations, not a big deal. But President Reagan thought he wasn't live yet. And this was broadcast out, where he said, I've just signed a law outlawing the Soviet Union. Missiles are on the way. Okay, that's what we call a funny joke. The Soviets didn't take it as a joke. I don't think so. That's actually kind of psychotic. But then, at the same time, there was a mini-series called The Day After. Reagan watched it in the basement theater. I watched this live. Some of your parents and or grandparents might have watched this. And the movie's a little cheesy in some, it's a I think it was a 3-part or 4-part miniseries. But it was by far the #1 show of 1983. And everybody watched it. And during the middle of the Cold War at this time, where it seemed so close, thankfully, I didn't know how close it was actually. It was terrifying. It was absolutely terrifying. And Reagan watched this and supposedly went to his aides. Well, nuclear war could be really bad. He just never believed it could be that bad for whatever reason. I mean, Reagan read all the time, just Westerns. He didn't like read other things. And this really led Reagan to begin, maybe the Cold War is going too far. But let's get quickly to the 80s economy. While that's going on, remember the stagflation of the 70s? Well, there were 2 big recessions caused by the Federal Reserve raising interest rates. Really bad one, over 11% unemployment in 82. But as soon as they dropped interest rates, the economy began to get better. It's going to be known as the 80s boom. Unemployment will drop. And you see this big drop right here? Now, it's like any president, it's arguable how much direct impact they had. But Reagan definitely took advantage of that. Look at the economy. My programs are working. But the gap between the rich and the poor began to grow. At first, fast, and then exploded. Also, these tax cuts did not turn into more investment in the United States. It turned into what they would call by the 1990s globalization or outsourcing. The beginning of building factories in other countries. Now, they're always going to say overseas. But the first real big wave of building factories in other countries was American corporations begin to shut down their factories in the United States and build them in what country? What's that? Yeah, Mexico. And the way our tax code was written, they could actually get a tax break for that. So General Motors, for example, took half of their production, moved it overseas. General Electric just quit, the company that Thomas Edison started, quit making the light bulb in that decade. And they start outsourcing it to China. And so this is going to begin a big, massive increase in the trade deficit. And wages begin to stagnate. Wages had been going up dramatically every year, or I'm sorry, every decade since the 1930s. Beginning in 1980, family income remained stagnant all the way up to right today. It has a little increase right now. It is going up right now. We'll see how long that goes. The Federal Reserve is raising interest rates to stop that. But for the top, income went up dramatically. I should add, if this looks like, well, a slight increase, because this is the 1980 wage in real terms. Most families have, they went from one earner to two earners. That's the only way they can keep this here. Also, the Great Depression, see ya. The gap between the rich and the poor that was shrinking before turned into what they call the Great Divergence, where the gap between the rich and the poor went up. Now, I should add, that was the plan. Trickle-down economics is to pump money into the hands of wealthy. The wealthy people are better able to invest. This is the philosophy. Of course, this would lead to a stock market bubble, and then a tech bubble, then a housing bubble. But this blue is the income for the bottom 90%. The gap started getting closer. Beginning in 82, that's the tax cut. This is the top 10% of income gain. This one, it goes to 2012. This chart, I didn't have one that covered all the way from the Great Depression on. For the bottom 90%, they actually lost wealth. It's slightly going up, but it's been stagnant. This is another, we'll move on. So the election of 1984, Ronald Reagan, and he was a master politician. The economy was getting better. The feeling was the United States was winning the Cold War again. The Able Archer scare would not come out for another 5 years publicly. He defeated Carter's vice president, Walter Mondale of Minnesota. And it looked closer, and then at the last minute, there was just this switch. Once again, like in the last election, and Reagan personal popularity, without a doubt, swept through the South and Southern strategy. But Walter Mondale would nominate the first woman ever to be vice president in a major party ticket. That would happen again in 2008 when John McCain would nominate Sarah Palin, Alaska, and then 2020, the first woman ever to be elected on a major ticket happened. The first time there was ever a nominee was Geraldine Ferraro of New York. And so the next year, Miles City, big things happen. What happened? I graduated from high school. I know, big day, huh? And do you want to see some pictures of my class? You want to see it? So here I'm in class. I'm right there. That's Mr. Lund. And yes, I did participate in sports. Sports were a little different back in 1985. Did you know that? So here I am on the field of play with the top hats. So on that note, we'll finish the 90s tomorrow. Sound good? There's no photographic evidence of my life in Colorado. There's no cameras. I should somewhere do that. Oh, yes, I do. I even put it out so I wouldn't forget, and then I said it someplace. Oh, it's lunch. You guys have lunch. It's not right. I don't like having fourth, fifth, sixth.
I know. I'll just
Very good job.
I'll just grab the sticker from you tomorrow. To do whatever.
Oh yeah, you might not. Okay,
Oh,
yeah,
of
yeah,
course.
that's really cool.
Right? Right. See ya.
Lucky find.
Oh yeah, for sure.
What game are they playing? Cricket. Cricket is the next. Lunch.
Is it lunch?
Yep.
Oh.
Did you hear that screaming out in the hallway?
It wasn't very loud for me, so I didn't realize it.
There, one of the kids, I'm guessing more like one of the special.
Yeah.
Was screaming for some reason.
Oh, well.
He did it like right next to my ear, so now it hurts. How's your day today so far?
Doing okay. How was yours?
Oh, it's slow. One question. When did the Roman Empire turn from a republic to like an actual empire?
Well, it was happening for a while, but technically during Caesar, but during Augustus for sure. So 30, let's see, the Civil War, so about 20 BC.
What's funny is that they're like, what is it? They go like first, second, third, and then lunch, and then fourth.
Yeah,
So basically, for me, it's carpentry, lunch, then back to carpentry.
perfect.
Because carpentry is 2 classes superior.
That's what you will be able to stay here.
Hey, but I'll be coming back here after 4. You sound like that's such a terrible thing.
Oh.
Question, what's the time that goes back to our work class?
12:24 lunch.
12:44.
12:24.
I was about to say 12:44.
I know.
An hour, 15 minutes of lunch. Like I could write my autobiography in that time.
I want to read it.
Which honestly is just gonna be a repeat, because I do kind of similar things. it fifth period yet?
Forgot 18 minutes.
Question: were there guns during the time when Christopher Columbus discovered the New World? What kind of guns were they?
Arquebuses.
So they haven't really got the muskets yet.
Well, they were like primitive muskets. They weren't little.
And what other weapons did they use? I know they used a lot of pikes.
Well, yeah, pies, knives, swords, but you know, there's that cannon.
Yeah.
Halberd.
Question: who was the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire by the time of World War
I can't remember his name. He wasn't hardly in power. It was
I? Was he kind of like a figurehead?
yeah.
Kind of like how today Great Britain still has a queen, but she doesn't really have a whole lot of political power.
Yeah.
Timber Bay, I
Why do you have a flag of Danny DeVito?
Let's do.
To be honest, when I asked that question, I thought you were gonna ask, why don't you?
That's about one too.
What year was the first moon landing? That was during the Cold War.
69.
1969?
Yeah. $1969. Oh, you gotta go. See you next period.
Don't go crazy.
All right, Henry. I leave it. You're in charge.
Okay.
Can you flip your sheet?
Huh?
Can you run a time mile?
You can run a time mile while chasing your frisbee.
Just gonna throw the frisbee.
We'll figure it out. Maybe we'll just put it in a car. Recording my entire lunch.